I thought I'd start by just picking up on something that Tim's already mentioned, which is the Unep emissions gap report that came out yesterday. Just to give a bit more detail on that, Tim mentioned a rise of 2.2 degrees by the end of century. That's if net zero pledges are delivered. In terms of the NDCs themselves, they put us on track for 2.7 degrees Celsius. And in terms of 2030, current NDCs as submitted put emissions coming down by around about 7.5% by 2030 compared to the previous round of commitments made at Paris. And what's needed is around 55% reduction in order to have some chance of meeting the 1.5 degree goal. So as you can see, we're very much off track. And I think it's really important to say that net zero pledges would bring that 2.7 degrees Celsius rise down to 2.2, so an additional reduction of 0.5 degrees by the end of century. But as the report itself states, net zero pledges are still extremely vague, very incomplete, and importantly inconsistent with most NDC pledges for 2030. And the reason I highlight this is because we've had a couple of reports come out recently on climate change risk assessment, and another one on what impacts or potential impacts in the near term should worry us most. On that first report, the climate change risk assessment report, we also found that by end of century, based on a middle of the road emissions scenario, which we think we're broadly on, we will be reaching 2.7 degrees worth of temperature rise by the end of century. Very similar, in fact, exactly the same as the Unep report that came out yesterday. And I think some of the headline findings from that is most of the impacts under that emission scenario go beyond what countries can adapt to. Obviously, adaptation to climate change, resilience, etc., is extremely important, but we shouldn't place all of our eggs in that basket. Most of the impacts go far beyond what countries can adapt to, and within the next decade, those impacts are going to be locked in and we won't be able to really avert them.
Dan has made it clear what kind of future that awaits us if we fail to address this monumental challenge and threat that climate change is. In building on what he has said, I will focus more specifically on COP26, which is just a few days away now, and which is really important when it comes to addressing these risks and this impact that Dan pointed to in his presentation. So first of all, why is COP26 so important and what are the aims of this conference? Well, we know that we essentially need to halve global emissions by 2030 to have a decent chance of keeping the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement within reach. There is a big difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but every fraction of a degree really does make a big impact, a big difference. The Paris Agreement, which was adopted 6 years ago, has this bottom-up approach where each country itself decides by how much it wants to or aims to reduce its emissions by a certain year. But the targets that were submitted in 2015 are not ambitious enough to get us there. And this is where COP26 comes in. Head of governments are supposed to submit new targets every 5 years. And this is what they need to do ahead of Glasgow. But that is not all. Climate finance is another very important topic. In 2009, developed countries promised to mobilize $100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries. Of course, this money is not a silver bullet. It will not solve everything, but it is really important for building and maintaining trust between countries and for unlocking progress in other areas. And failure to provide clarity on this target has been creating a lot of frustration in the run-up to COP. Developed countries have now published a delivery plan for how to mobilize these funds, which I can say a few words about later. And in addition to this, there will also be more kind of technical negotiations at COP26, for instance, around international carbon markets. And the UK government is, as COP president, encouraging countries to make bold commitments in key sectors like coal and protecting nature to really get implementation underway, because as Dan pointed to earlier, pledges themselves are not enough. They of course need to be implemented. So in a nutshell, COP26 is not about negotiating a new international climate change treaty. It's about raising ambition and implementing the one that we have.
So I thought that I'm going to do something that I don't usually do, which is that I'm not going to start with the doom and gloom and why everything is not enough. I'm going to try and look at why is it that actually we can afford to look at what we have today as an extremely solid background upon which to build on, and that there is still a lot more to fight for, a lot more to do. And therefore, what we just heard just now, while extraordinarily important setting, but actually is only a starting point for more work and more mobilization. And that most definitely not all is lost. Now, if I start where Anna almost kind of left, which is the whole point about ambition in some ways, it is easy, obviously, to count them. And we kind of knew, frankly, a while ago that it wasn't going to add up. So in some ways, we can know that. But at the same time, I kept reminding myself that before Paris, we're talking about heading to a 4-degree world. And yet at the same time, and I know that Dan and Tim just now described it a little bit differently in terms of the 2.7 versus 2.2 degree that we're heading. But the reality is that what it tells us is that if we add the mid-century target, especially up by 2050, we are heading in the right direction, even though the 2.7 around 2030, unless we do more, is firmly putting our focus really on why action now is the most important. Now, to me, that is not only important, but also is an important change in focus that we're not really, I think it belongs to be Anna and others have been saying that we are a bit bored by listening to plans about plans. And everything is about delivery, delivery, delivery. And absolutely is all about delivery, delivery. And it's delivery now. And this is something we can still do, which is why I don't think this is all doom and gloom, on the basis that if the mid-century alignment is roughly in the right path, at the same time, we need to do more today. This is something we can do today to try and mobilize the politics. So obviously, I am trying to put rather brave face in the face of something quite challenging. And as Anna lined up, indeed, there are many that are not yet ended up.